Hello, everybody, and welcome in to this Wednesday edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast. I am your host, Jared Mack. With me always is Erik Skopil. Erik, how we doing today? How we living?
Life's pretty good. It's the weather
Good?
shifted overnight, as
Yeah.
you can tell by Jared's hat there.
I
Kind
mean,
of kind of cold out there.
my hair is just atrocious today. I can't
Okay,
put it
well,
on television
it's
or
an aesthetic
podcast here
choice.
for the YouTube people. It's
Oh,
nonsense.
just terrible, Jared. Just terrible.
It's
Put that
awful.
back on.
Thank you. No.
No, life's
Good.
good. Preparing for Michigan here. We got to watch a couple of practices, which is new. We hadn't been out there for a couple of weeks, so
Mhm.
we have some actual insights to share on injuries. Not that it's super definitive by any means, but we have things we can share that other fans and people don't have. So we'll get into some of that. But yeah, Jared, you're going to Michigan on Friday. Exciting times.
Sure am. Yeah, flying into Detroit. It's going to be a good time. Very excited to go to the big house for an official game. I've been there previously, like on campus and seen the stadium and everything like that. But very excited for this game. And for those of you who don't know, Oregon is playing Michigan this Saturday, starting at 12:30 Pacific on CBS. Back-to-back weeks on CBS for the Oregon Ducks as part of their, inaugural season in the Big Ten. So that's a fun part of all of this. But another thing for those of you who don't know, this Wednesday episode is just going to be like Erik and I kind of going over some injury updates with Oregon, discussing some or highlighting some key players who were or were not at practice, were or were not at the last game, stuff like that. And then our own little dissection of what we see from Michigan from an Oregon perspective and where we think that Oregon can do well. But let's start with the injury notes. So for some reason this week we had practice access. Last week we did not have practice access. So we appreciate that. It was a shortened version of the practice access, but we were able to take some notes on some guys who were or were not there. Most notably, I think this is probably going to be the majority of the segment here is just Jordan Birch and Terrence Ferguson were both back at practice this past week. They both seem to be full participants in the very limited action that we saw. Whether or not they will play in the game this upcoming Saturday is yet to be seen. I would imagine one is more likely than the other, but that's just kind of my read on the situation. But still, it's really positive momentum going forward. If you're Oregon, you need these guys down the home stretch. They've been able to withstand the last two games without Ferguson pretty darn well, the last couple of games without Jordan Birch pretty darn well. So I think it'll be just, like a rejuvenation into the defense side of the ball and the offensive side of the ball. But that's the big storyline, quote unquote, from this week of practice observations and kind of like the injury notes.
Yeah, and Dan started it on Monday by saying both players were questionable, but they were available for Monday's practice and that they would just kind of see how the week went. Again, I think the thing that stands out, Jared said we kind of saw a different amount. We in the past had seen, I don't even know if I want to refer to it as a full contact period, but we saw a period where there was like hitting, there was a little bit of trench.
It was football.
Back and forth. Yeah, it looked like stuff that looked like football and stuff that, frankly, you need to be kind of close to full strength to take part in. That's what we'd seen in the past. This week we didn't get any of that. And so it's hard for us, I think, to give a real assessment of like what Ferguson and Birch's availability is because they look fine. Like Ferguson fielding kicks and people are going to he's not as a kick returner, but like they have the tight ends and outside linebackers, the guys who are kind of the blockers, the protection on the kick. Those guys working on fair catches and just catching a football. He's doing that. Jordan Birch, we watched him a little bit of kind of like grappling with the defensive, a teammate. Saw him do some sled work today. Like looks like he's moving around pretty well, but we have not seen these guys do anything that's close to actual game action. So that's kind of where we are with that. I think it's encouraging for both players to be in a place where they're able to be at practice at all, especially Birch. I think Ferguson is kind of the natural progression a couple weeks after the appendectomy. Seems like he could be out there doing some things. I think with Birch, with a knee injury, you're kind of like, I don't know what the timeline is. I think for a while it felt like you'd be lucky if you'd play in the regular season at all. And the fact that it's possibly plays this week or maybe next week or whatnot, I think that's really encouraging. So I think positive news, just probably not as clear as we would like it to be, but that's sort of the expectation for covering this team with the way the program is with injuries.
Yeah, 100%. I think just like I kind of finished with, like, regardless, it's just good news to see these guys back on the field. They are clearly like in the process of returning to, I won't say 100% health because, we're 8 football games in, like nobody's at 100% health, but returning to healthy enough to be playing their normal roles, which are really important impact players on both sides of the ball for this number one Oregon team going forward. And that's really, all you can ask for at this point is guys coming back from injuries, not necessarily guys going down with injuries. And, knock on wood here, it is football. It's a physical and violent sport. So injuries are due to happen. But other than that, for the most part, this team is pretty
Seems
darn
healthy, man.
healthy. Another guy who's not really notable, but just something that we picked up on, defensive lineman Michael Gardner, redshirt freshman, was back at practice today. We've seen him around the facility, the compound, in like practice uniform afterwards, but we never really saw him walking into practice. But today was different. We saw him walking in. As a guy who suffered I can't remember if it was a right or a left leg injury during fall camp preseason. Dan, at that point during the fall, never shut the door on him potentially returning. So this could be something. Oregon, obviously, they got a month left of the regular season. Will we see him in that time? I doubt it, but this could be a guy where, if Oregon does make the postseason run that plenty of us expect to, the season is going to go into another 6 weeks, 7 to 8 weeks, depending on how far they go in the playoffs, if they do make it, and they do the things that some of us are expecting them to do. That would just be another potential depth guy, an impact guy, a player who's young and talented who played a lot last season. So that was just another kind of notable thing that I took away from practice this week. But trying to think if there's any other clearly obvious injury dudes.
The other one that was kind of notable in the same vein was Ayuli being in cleats both days, and kind of actually, I don't want to say, again, we didn't see full contact, but doing drills with the offensive line, which is something we had not seen all the way up to this point. Again, we missed a couple of weeks of practice. Practice was closed fully for the Illinois week. It was closed because it was a shortened week for Purdue. I think the last time we had seen practice was the Tuesday before Ohio State. So it's been a minute. So it's possible Ayuli was, this isn't nothing new for him. It's possible he's been doing that for 2 weeks. But for us, this is the first time that it looked like he's actually, I don't know, getting closer. And the injury designation was questionable on Saturday against Illinois. So this is somebody who obviously
for the first time all year.
Right? Yeah, for the first time all year, you should say. Yeah, good point, Jared. This is somebody who they're not reshuffling the starting five. Those guys are going to be there. But this was a guy that we thought might have a chance to start when the season began. We'll see. This is at least encouraging from a depth perspective of a guy who the staff clearly thinks highly of. And another part of this is he never used a redshirt year. And we've now gotten to the point where whenever he does return, he will use one this year. He's not going to be able to play more than the 4 games. So that part stands out. And again, we're now talking about those two guys who are less integral than Birch and Ferguson, who are like, Birch is one of your 2 or 3 best defensive players. Ferguson's one of your 2 or 3 most important pass catchers in this offense. These are like really important pieces. These 2 other guys, though, to your point, Jared, Oregon could play 9 more games.
Really? Oh, jeez, dude.
They played 8 games. We could be at the halfway point. Yeah, I believe so. 5 for sure, because they've got the 4 regular season, and then they got the Big Ten championship game. And then if they're not on a bye, it's 4 games.
Yeah.
So it's, we could be like at the midway.
A lot of football.
It's crazy. So, but that's why there's value for an Ayuli or a Gardner being available potentially to help with some of that down the line. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I think, the Reader's Digest, positive developments with the 2 guys that really matter. And then the other guys are players who probably aren't going to be massive impact players when they are available. But I think especially with Ayuli, I get the sense that he might be coming back, or at least available to play maybe within the next couple of weeks. So I think that's positive for the O-line depth for sure. Yeah,
I don't really have anything else, if I'm being frank. Like that's the gist of it.
That's it for me. Yeah, that's what we've got. So want to turn and talk some Michigan.
Yeah, absolutely. What side of the ball would you like to discuss?
I think
defense.
Well, I think the
special teams. I'll tell you what, Michigan's kicker is damn good.
Their punter's not very good. We actually start special teams. We just talk special teams for
Good.
5 minutes.
I'm here for
No,
it.
I think the part that's most here's where I'm at. I think the part that is most impactful potentially is when Michigan has the football. Not that I think Oregon's offense is a lock every week to score more than 31 points, even though that's what they've done in Big Ten play. But Michigan's offense has looked very far away from being able to match that type of scoring output. I don't think they've scored more than 27 points in Big Ten play all season. There have been weeks where they've looked completely anemic. And as everybody's aware, they've had probably about as weird of a year with the quarterback situation as I can think of, and especially for a program that's coming off a national championship where you figured, oh, they'll have something figured out at this position. And that just hasn't been the case, to the point where we've gone full circle with Michigan's quarterback situation. And the guy they started the year with is now the guy that they're back to. And the guy that they had started the year with is kind of like, hey, he's the supplementary running quarterback. Like, they're basically back to week one in terms of the setup after going through a couple of different iterations of this, including starting a guy who's now medically retired. So it's been a very strange year for Michigan's offense, and especially its pass game. And I think the thing that stands out when you look at this is, like, each of these guys individually, like, do things kind of pretty well, but collectively, I don't think there's a good quarterback in terms of just all checking all the boxes amongst these guys. Like, you watch Davis Warren, I don't think he has a massive arm, but he's a pretty reliable passer. And he seems like, for the most part, he kind of knows where he wants to go with the football. I know he's had interception problems, but he's not had problems with accuracy necessarily. Then you've got Alex Orji, who can't really throw a football, but boy, can that guy run. And so you kind of look at it and you're like, if you could just merge them together, and I'm sure this is what Wolverine fans have been talking about all year, you'd have a really good player. Unfortunately, that's not what you have. And if you're Oregon going into this, I think at times Michigan might tip their hand where, well, when Warren's out there, there's a decent chance they'll pass. I don't know how much success they'll have, but when Orji's out there, it's like, that guy's there to run. And that's something that they turned to with some success last week. I know he led Michigan in rushing against the Spartans. But that's something I'm very much like, I think that's the place you start is Michigan's quarterback situation actually good enough to beat a team like Oregon that is as well-rounded as they are? And despite a bunch of stuff we'll get to on kind of defense and, you know, the atmosphere, and does this team have like a certain championship mentality that gives them a shot? I just wonder if they have enough at quarterback to really challenge a team as good as Oregon. And I think the answer is they don't.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I lean as well. I mean, it's just a bad offense. Like, I think from not from top to bottom, they've got some talent, but they're 21 points a game. It's like 110th or 111th in the country. It's just not great. And it all stems with the quarterback. I mean, you look in the NFL and you look at all like the worst teams in the league, they all have quarterback problems. You look at, the worst teams in college football, they all have quarterback problems. Like, this is what makes an offense go. And we've seen the last couple of years for Oregon with Dylan Gabriel and Bo Nix, like, very good quarterbacks. Maybe not like the NFL first round pick type quarterbacks I know Bo Nix was the exception there, but for a lot of his tenure at Oregon, it was like, well, maybe he'll be a first pick, and DG not so much. But you look back a couple of years ago where it is Anthony Brown who's starting, or in the COVID season where it's Tyler Shuck who's starting, where you have problems at quarterback where, guys just aren't accurate. Guys just don't necessarily make the big plays. They don't have the arm strength. They don't know how to read a defense, stuff like that, where that can really, cripple a team and just make it so all the defense has to do is focus on one threat, and that's Michigan's running duo of Donovan Edwards and Kalel Mullings, which is one of the better ones Oregon will face all year.
It's very good.
Those are two really standout running backs. But when you're a one-dimensional offense, and it's a lot easier to be a defense going against a one-dimensional running offense than it is a passing offense. You look at like the Mike Leach Washington States, where it is really more or less one-dimensional than just in terms of passing. But you can, if you have a good quarterback in that system, I mean, you saw some of those Washington State teams, like with Gardner Minshew, like they can really score the ball. And Michigan is not that. They have yet to throw over 208 yards in a game this year. which is really hard.
Yeah.
It's impressive. Let's see. Against Minnesota, 86 yards.
Yeah.
Against USC, 32 yards of passing in that
Shared
game.
my favorite stat, and I shared it on the last podcast. This will be a repeat for some. Their receiver with the most receiving yards has 118 yards 8 games into a season, and that just tells the whole story. 8 games in, they have 118 yards.
They have more interceptions than they do touchdown passes. The trio of quarterbacks, including Jack Tuttle, who just recently retired due to a concussion and an ulnar collateral ligament injury in his throwing arm. That trio of quarterbacks between him and Orgy and Warren, they've thrown for a combined 1,044 yards this year. Dylan Gabriel has surpassed that by double by himself. And he's like not played some of the games, not played all of the game, but not played some of the fourth quarters in this season. So that could be an even larger number. But yeah, I just don't think they have. And the other thing is that Oregon's pass defense is quite good.
It's very
They've been doing a very good job this year. And I think that Michigan has some talent on the outside. Like, I think that some of their receivers are good. And obviously Loveland, their tight end, is a very quality tight end who could be maybe a first-round pick, but certainly a future NFL guy. They just can't get him the ball.
Yeah.
And this will just come down to, can Oregon stop the run?
Yeah, that's how I look at it. And the other thing for me is, can Michigan scheme it up enough where they can manufacture? Like against Michigan State, Donovan Edwards threw a touchdown pass to Colston Loveland. Like, can they find these wrinkles, these kind of unusual, unorthodox ways to create explosive plays? Because, I mean, you're right on. Like, this is a bad quarterback situation. I don't want to say, I mean, they're both pretty bad quarterbacks. We'll just be honest. Like, these are not elite quarterbacks. Davis Warren's a former walk-on who's, to his credit, it's a good story. He's developed himself into being a starter at Michigan. That's impressive. But they're also going against a secondary for Oregon that's been awesome against just about everybody. And I think PFF has them number 2 in coverage in terms of that grade, along with the fact that you look at the counting stats, and there hasn't been a quarterback other than Will Howard, I think, who's completed more than 60% of his passes, and almost everybody's turned it over. So yeah, this is a tough setup for, I think, Michigan's offense. And that's why I think that it's hard for me to see a path to Michigan actually pulling this upset off unless its defense is so stifling that it just completely eliminates Oregon's offense, which they weren't able to do against Illinois, which they weren't able to do against Texas, which they weren't able to do even really against USC. I know they won that game, but they gave up some points there, and USC was in position to win. The real path would be like pick sixes and fumble recoveries that put the ball at the goal line.
Yeah.
And just like Michigan's offense doesn't have to do any of the heavy lifting, and its defense just carries them to the finish line. That is from my perspective, really the only way this goes the Wolverines' way. So because of that, I'm pretty optimistic about this game, as you can probably tell. And I think 3 things that also stand out for Michigan, and I guess I'm touching on one of them, but playing in a 110,000 person environment, could that throw Oregon's offense off a little bit? Could this be a game where Poncho's really struggling to get the snap back? Could this be a game where the offense is a little out of sorts because of the environment? And we'll get to defensive line talent here in a second in more detail, but could the fact that, as for Poncho, you're lined up and right over your nose is Mason Graham or Kenneth Grant, and those guys are very explosive off the ball.
We'll get there.
We'll definitely get there. These are the guys we're excited to talk about coming into this matchup, because it's not Michigan's offense that people are excited about. It's that defense. But could the anticipation of what those guys are going to do cause there to be issues, and there's just a bunch of havoc and Oregon kind of unravels? That would be the path, theoretically, to this game kind of getting muddy enough for Michigan. But we haven't seen Poncho do this, right? Like, he really hasn't played in a tough road environment, and he certainly hasn't played against defensive linemen this good. But I've got a lot of confidence in him and this entire operation to think that even if it is quote unquote bad and we see some issues and Michigan's players are going to win their fair share, especially these guys that are potentially top 5, top 10 draft picks, I just think collectively Oregon's line is taking a huge step, and I think will be plenty good to get the offense to where it needs to go in this one. It might not be a game where you see them score 35 points. It certainly isn't a game where you're going to see them score 35 points in the first half, I don't think. But I do think the offense, based upon some other things we can get to in a second here, maybe we just do this transition now. Was there anything else you had on when Michigan has the football really you want to touch on? I think maybe we can just jump to when Oregon has it now.
Well, I was going to make a comparison here. This game reminds me a lot of Oregon and Utah last year, where this is kind of a one-dimensional offense as Utah was last year, I think, with Bryson Barnes as quarterback. It was on the road. Granted, that Oregon team, they had, Jax Powers Johnson, who had played in a lot of games at center.
Right.
But the kind of the makings are here where, that Utah team couldn't really throw the ball. They had to rely heavily on the run. Oregon stuffed it. They created some turnovers with their secondary, and they ended up winning 35-6. I don't think that'll be the final score. I think Michigan's defense is far superior than Utah's last year, even though that Utah team was a solid defense across the board, and it always kind of has been. But just kind of feels that way where it's like, okay, well, this team can't really throw the ball, and Oregon really has to settle and just try to stop the run. And the upper hand in terms of running back value or running back talent is clearly on Michigan's side. But I just kind of get those feelings where it's like, this is really, really one-dimensional offense that Oregon has to go into. And, make no mistake, like this could be like the USC game for Michigan where they only throw the ball for 32 yards, like I said earlier, but they ran the ball for over 200. I think it might have been even near 300 yards.
I know
total.
Mullings had 159. Yeah, so
it's 290.
Yeah.
So if you're Oregon, you have to eliminate those big runs that USC's defense physically just could not do. On the flip side, Oregon's rush defense is much better than USC's.
Much.
So that's a positive thing for them because, Michigan ran for 300 and 290 against Arkansas State and Southern California. Since then, it's 155, 174, 114, 119. The average yards per carry at max has been 4.7. So when they've gone back and played better defenses, and by better defenses, I mean Minnesota, Washington, Illinois, who Oregon just ran for 223 yards against, and Michigan State, it's kind of gone back down because you can just run 7 in the box and really not care about Davis Warren and what he's going to do with the ball until he proves that he can make a deep throw, which hasn't happened a lot this year.
And first, love the Utah comparison. I think that's spot on for a lot of reasons. That's a good one. No, it was because you think about the environment, you think about the quarterback issues. Utah's defensive front isn't Michigan's, but it's still very good. And the way Oregon was able to come out and attack it. And I think one of the things with the crowd noise, which I've also heard from, I don't know if this is just salty Midwesterners that are tired of Michigan winning, but I've heard from so many people that the big house isn't even that loud. Like there's a lot of people there, but it doesn't really impact the game as much. Whether that's true or not, one thing that I know Nishad Strother, that Poncho today certainly talked about was the idea of getting off to a fast start on offense and just taking the crowd out of the game, which is exactly what happened in Salt Lake City, where College Game Day was there. That was shaping up to be an environment. It was loud early. And then Oregon comes down and scores. And then Utah punts, I think. And then Oregon scores again. And then I think Utah had a turnover. And suddenly it was like 21-3, it felt like, out of nowhere. And it was no one's really there to make noise. And suddenly the atmosphere goes away. That's sort of the path. And, I think when Oregon has the football, a couple of things that stand out for me is I think it's imperative Oregon is able to run the football with some effectiveness. Michigan, the last 2 weeks, has its 2 worst games in terms of at least opposing rush output. Yeah. I think both Illinois and Michigan State were over 150. This is a defense that had not allowed, I think maybe one team had run for more than 100 coming in, like something like that. Like you might have the stats in front of too.
Yeah, I got them right in front of me. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was a defensive, this is a defense that had not really allowed opposing run games to do much. Last 2 weeks, a little bit better. And Oregon's run game, I think, is starting to find its footing. I think what we saw from Noah Whittington last week was pretty damn important for this team. Yeah. Because 100%. I think if you look at what preceded that I don't think it was, the Purdue game excluded as well, but prior to the Purdue game, Oregon had really leaned on Jordan James. It almost got to the point where it wasn't a by committee backfield, it was this is Jordan James's job, and maybe Noah will play a little bit, but Jordan had over 20 carries, 3 straight games. I think the fact that Noah's starting to play a little better is pretty impactful here, and that gives me more confidence just in I'm sure this is a game where they'd like to feed Jordan 20 times, and maybe that's part of the reason he's kind of been a little bit less involved the last couple of weeks, shall we say. But I think Noah's kind of reemergence is really significant because, again, I think this is a game where if Michigan just makes it 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9 over and over again, I feel pretty darn good about Dylan Gabriel converting, because we just saw them convert 3rd and 16s and all sorts of things like that over the course of the year. This is not a pass offense that can't rescue you, but when this offense is playing its best, it's an offense that's facing 3rd and 4 and 3rd and 5. And that allows you to have the full arsenal to say, hey, we don't necessarily have to throw it down the field or even intermediate. We can throw this. We can get the screen game involved here. We can get the ball to Tez in space and just let him do what he does. So I think it's really important that Oregon's run game steps up. I think it's really important that they avoid the pre-snap mistakes, whether it's a snap or if it's a false start or if it's people being out of position and Michigan just kind of disrupting things. So, and then the other part to me, and I know I was talking about this before we started, Jared, that has kind of stood out in talking with both Zach, who was on our podcast yesterday, and then Alejandro, who is another one of the reporters who did a Q&A swap with us. So he answered some questions. They both brought up the fact that Michigan, especially in the secondary, is not a good tackling team. And we know how Oregon likes to attack opposing offenses. We just watched Illinois have an incredibly hard time getting Oregon's players down in open space, whether it be Kenyon Sadiq on some screens or Tez Johnson in the open field or, even the running backs. Whittington broke 2 of them in that one kind of little screen pass that he scored it out for the sideline. I think that part is pretty important to think about when you go into this game, because you think of Michigan, you go sound defense. They don't make a lot of mistakes. They had 19 missed tackles against Michigan State. I think they had 14 against Illinois. They had like 15 against Texas. They had a pretty large number against USC as well. Pro Football Focus grades them as the 74th best tackling team in the country. So they're even a little below middle of the road. And you're going against an Oregon offense that's so dynamic and so capable of making players miss that I just think that's something to keep in mind going into this matchup of, maybe there's a scenario where Michigan does succeed on early downs, but maybe Oregon's skill players are good enough to make it not matter as much because they are able to make a pass that's, a 4-yard pass on 3rd and 8 becomes a 12-yard gain because Tez cuts up field and breaks a couple tackles. So these are some of the things I'm thinking about when we're talking about when Oregon has the football. Go ahead and wax poetically now about your 2 guys.
2 guys.
Everyone's 2 guys. I mean, the 2 guys. The guys.
Of course. Before I do that, we're going to take a quick break in this podcast, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about Michigan's defense against Oregon's offense. All right, we are back. We were here to talk about Oregon and Michigan this weekend, 12:30 Pacific time on CBS for the 2nd straight week. We're here specifically talking about Michigan's defensive front against Oregon's offensive line. And Michigan's defensive front has some real monsters, some real NFL high upside guys, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, and Josiah Stewart. I almost said Jakeem Stewart. Jakeem Stewart is a 5-star prospect.
He is.
He has a nickname. I can't remember what it is. But Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant are the interior defensive linemen, and they're just monsters, man.
Yeah.
They're 2 of the best interior defensive linemen in the entire country in terms of college football. Both rank really highly on PFF. If that means anything to you, it means a little bit to me, especially considering Mason Graham's defensive grade is a 90.3, and Josiah Stewart's is a 93.3. So they do their job quite well. Both of them have 23 total pressures this season. Graham is capable of both stopping the run and running after the passer. That's what makes him such a highly sought after draft prospect. I mean, he's nearly like a unanimous 1st rounder. This comes in like a long lineage of impressive defensive linemen from Michigan in the last couple of seasons under Harbaugh. Aiden Hutchinson, Mozzie Smith was a guy who was injured, but before he was injured, he was really good. Now he's in the NFL, and he's okay for the Cowboys. It's just another dude, and this is someone that you're going to have to watch on Saturday. He has the potential to really wreck the game from Oregon's offensive standpoint, because this is going to be, like we talked about a little bit earlier, this is going to be Poncho's first time on a big road environment. I know that they went to Purdue and I know that they went to Oregon State, but
hey, now
just not.
UCLA too. Don't you forget about the Rose Bowl on a
Yeah,
raucous Friday night.
on a raucous Friday night in Westwood. Yeah. No, this is going to be a much different experience than all of those things. It's been during interviews this week, a lot about the silent count and what that's going to entail. They haven't really used it this year. And the big house is probably going to have 110,000 people there. This is going to be the first time Oregon will be there since 2007. So it's going to be a big game no matter what. And when you're silent counting and against a big crowd and Mason Graham is looking you in the eye as a future first round NFL draft pick, like, that's going to be a really tough assignment. And then to his right or left, depending on the alignment, is Kenneth Grant, and then Josiah Stewart's on the other side, probably an edge rusher. Like, this is a really good defensive front. This is, I would say, the best that Oregon will see all year long, depending on who they play, potentially in the playoffs or, potentially in the Big Ten championship game, because I think Penn State's is really darn good too. But to me, this is a better defensive line than Ohio State's, and that has future NFL guys. So this is where, from Michigan, if they want to win this game, they have to generate pressure against Dylan Gabriel and maybe force him into making a mistake. Or when it's first down and Oregon goes, 4 wide with Jordan James in the backfield, they get pressure, they get a sack on Gabriel, and it's 2nd and 16 and not 2nd and 4, 2nd and 5. Like, that's going to be the differences when it comes to Michigan, having a chance to win this game, if I'm being honest, because if Oregon's defensive line can perform the way they did against Ohio State, which wasn't great compared to other games that they've had, but good enough where Gabriel was pressured, but he was never sacked. There were only a handful of tackles for loss. They went against NFL guys and did their job. Gabriel threw for, 341 yards, I think it was, against Ohio State. If they can protect Gabriel for long enough to go find Tez, Stewart, Trayshawn, Justice Lowe, whoever it may be, then it's a real problem for Michigan, because we went over the tackling portion of this before the break. Will Johnson, who is probably the best cornerback in the country, him or Travis Hunter, if you think he's better, whatever. That's, if he doesn't play, if Will Johnson does not play on Saturday, then I think Oregon has a very, very, very clear advantage in the secondary. Although I do like a lot of the Michigan players in the secondary. I just think that the way Tez and Evan and Trayshawn and Justice kind of all work off each other, I think, is a real dominant advantage. And it goes more than that with just pass advantage. If Oregon's offensive line can get a push up front, Jordan James and Noah Whittington could have a good day at the office. And then all of a sudden you don't need to rely on the pass with Gabriel, even though it's okay if you do, because he is really good. It's just, this is going to be, to me, like when I go to the game and I'm sitting there and I'm watching in the first quarter, how much of a push Oregon's offensive line gets against these guys from Michigan is going to be the story of the game for me early on.
And I think I'll make just one distinction here between Ohio State and Michigan, because these are undoubtedly the two most talented defensive fronts you're facing in the regular season. Not that Ohio State had bad interior defensive linemen, but I think they were probably best off the edge. This is the inverse. And to me, that is potentially a concern, because that was strength on strength with Ohio State. Like, Oregon's tackles are NFL players. Again, I don't know where Josh Conlon and Johnny Cornelius are getting drafted, but these are players that are going to be in the NFL. The same thing with JTT and Jack Sawyer. So that was strength on strength. Now you're talking about Graham and Grant going against the interior. And I think Oregon's interior offensive line is probably almost a little underrated. I've heard people say that they're actually, like, it's a detriment, or that they're not good enough there. Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that, but I think pretty objectively, just looking across the board on this offense, that's probably the weakest point of this offense, right? I mean, the quarterback's the Heisman Trophy favorite. They've got incredibly talented receivers. The tight ends, when they're all there, are really good. I think we're starting to see the running back depth develop. I've already mentioned the offensive tackles. Those are, all conference, those are players that'll be playing on Sundays. The interior of the offensive line is probably the biggest concern, right? And when you're going against two elite interior defensive linemen, you do feel like, okay, that could be a strength on weakness kind of matchup for Michigan in their favor. And that's where that hasn't really been the case all year, where a team's been able to take advantage of that. So that's just a thing to keep in mind. Again, I'm not suggesting at all that I think Michigan's just going to totally stifle Oregon's offense, because they didn't even do that against Illinois. They didn't even do that against Michigan State, right? Like both those teams were able to score some points, move the ball pretty effectively throughout. I just think you need to be kind of aware of, this is a little bit of a different matchup. Like when you say Ohio State has an awesome defensive line and Michigan has an awesome defensive line, they're awesome in kind of different ways. And the way that Michigan is from my perspective at least, more concerning than Ohio State, just because it's right in the middle there, where Oregon has really improved, but still I think that's probably the weakness on that offense.
Yeah, 100%. No disagreement with me. Like that's, if you had to pick a spot in the offensive line, the interior is the weakest. And I mean that like the way you said it, like Connerly and Cornelius are two NFL dudes who have done incredibly well during their careers here at Oregon. And then, Cornelius at Rhode Island. Like this is a big step up for Poncho, for Struther. Marcus Harper's had his fair share of battles.
Yeah.
But that's going to be the battle. And if Oregon can do well, if they get pushed, I just closed the tab, but the last two games, teams have done well rushing the ball against Michigan, like we were talking about earlier. They ran for 187, 163 yards. Granted, it was on 38 and 42 attempts, but that's okay. Oregon probably won't need to run that many times because they'll have a passing attack, unlike Illinois and unlike Michigan State, who we've seen this year that don't have a great passing attack. Like the more Oregon can open up deep shots, the more likely it is that they're going to have more opportunities on the ground when they have to, bring only 6 in the box, and all of a sudden it's a weak front. You could run outside, you can do zone schemes or whatever you want to do, where you pull guards or whatever. But I think Oregon gets away with the pressure from the interior by implementing what they always do, and that's just like a lot of screen passes, a lot of quick hitters, a lot of, hey, we're not going to give you the time to rush the quarterback. And when you think we're going to do another screen, suddenly it's going to be like one of those famous Marcus Arroyo fake tight end screens on the outside, and suddenly he jets up the sideline. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a play like that in this game where they get the defense thinking that they're going to do short hitters, quick hitters, like a lot of it was last year. Like we've seen plenty of times this year with Sadiq or Tez or whoever. And I think that's the way that Oregon gets away from that interior pressure from Graham and Grant. But we'll see.
Yeah.
Which is why they play the games. That's what I would do if I'm the offensive court. If I'm Will Stein and I'm playing these guys, like I would try to do that, or at least try to get outside and get away from them. But still, this is a really talented defense. There's NFL players across the board, excuse me. It's just that these two, Grant and Graham, and then Stewart, the third guy on the edge, those are the cream of the crop. And then Will Johnson, if he plays, that makes a big difference. But this is still a really good defense. Like Oregon, I think some fans have kind of, the idea of like Michigan even beating Oregon seems like a far-fetched reality for some fans because of how bad Michigan has been this year. It's like, no, like this is a really good defense. Like if there's a team that can win defense alone, this could be one of those teams across the country as Michigan, just because of how talented they are at specific positions.
Here's kind of my overriding prediction for Saturday is if we come out on our post-game podcast, we're saying Oregon's offensive line either played Michigan to a stalemate or was better, or just at the very least, Michigan's defensive line didn't just totally wreck the game. I think we're probably talking after Oregon wins and probably covers and maybe even wins pretty decidedly. And by that, I mean 21, 28 point margin. Like, I think that is on the table if these guys don't just totally throw Oregon's offense out. Like the path to Michigan being competitive or even winning would be Oregon's offense scores 21 points and Michigan scores 24 points. And Oregon's offense doesn't do that with any level of consistency. And there's 3 and outs, and there's turnovers, and there's possessions where it just looks ugly. And that's kind of the path to Michigan winning. And
100%.
I think for Oregon, there's so many of these matchups when you kind of dig further into it that favor them, that I have a lot of confidence we don't go there, because I almost feel to a certain extent there's a path to Michigan winning, and we just kind of ran through it, and it's a pretty clear path. But it feels like there's kind of like one outcome, like our one script for this game where Michigan wins. And it feels like almost all the other ones favor Oregon, because I think when Oregon has the football, they have the speed advantage out in space. And again, Michigan hasn't been great at tackling. I think Oregon on defense has the type of athletes to mitigate some of what they do on the ground. And certainly I'm not going into this game all that concerned about Michigan's pass offense, nor should I think any defense, but especially Oregon here, who's been really great. And I wouldn't be surprised if Davis Warren, who has 6 interceptions this season, and I granted credit to him, he didn't have any against Michigan State, but that the way he's at least put the ball into trouble's way at times, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a game where Oregon forces 2 or 3 turnovers. And that's the sort of script towards not only does Oregon win, but they win really decisively. And maybe it's a game where, even similar to the Illinois game, you go in the fourth quarter and it's like, okay, there's a bunch of backups out there. So this game could go a variety of ways, but I think for Michigan to actually have a real chance of doing anything crazy and pulling the upset, it has to go kind of one very specific type of way.
Yeah, it feels kind of similar to the Illinois game going into it. It's like, wow, Illinois is incredible with their turnover margin. And they got, they were +7 or whatever it was. And it's like, if Illinois is going to win the game, like, they have to force 2 or 3 turnovers from Oregon. They didn't come close. And then they win 38-9. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that going against this Michigan team. There are other things that Oregon will need to focus on in terms of beating this defense, but turnover battle for sure. Like, you just can't make dumb mistakes on the road in the big house against a team that's, like, this team still fights. It's not like, maybe not like USC where, oh no, it's a losing season. And then it's like, all right, well, we got to go to work on Saturday, I guess. Like, no, this is a team that really takes pride in their program and their own play and their coach. Like, they're going to come out and hopefully play upset. Like, they can't win it all this year, but at the end of the day, they're still the reigning national champion. They still got a lot of talent. They're going to come out here and try to play upset against Oregon in their first year in the Big Ten. They're going to try to show them, who's boss, who's been the boss of the Big Ten recently. So turnover battle is going to be huge, and then just starting strong. I think it's the biggest key for Oregon.
Once again, if Oregon's up 14-0 in the first half or whatever, I just don't see Michigan being a team that has a real shot of coming back based upon the way they're constructed. I'm happy you brought up the kind of the championship mentality thing and the pride this program has, because this is a team that's clearly not quit. Even though they just had probably a brutal, borderline embarrassing loss for them to Illinois. I know that was on the road, but Illinois is not a program that had been very competitive. I think that was Illinois' first win over Michigan since 2009, I think was the stat I saw. Something like that. And to be not really even competitive in the fourth quarter, that's pretty embarrassing. But for them to then follow that up, beat a rival, by the way, Michigan State's been playing low-key pretty well. They really put it on Iowa a couple weeks ago. Like, this is a Michigan team that still remains dangerous in terms of, like, they won a national championship last year for a reason. There's a bunch of pieces back from that team. I know it's not all the core pieces, but there's enough players here that I think going into this, you expect them to have a certain level of confidence that probably isn't maybe deserving for a 5-win team, if that makes sense, just because of what they've been through and what this program has established. So I expect them to give it their best. They're going against the number 1 team in the country. They do not want to be embarrassed on their home field. And frankly, they're playing for bowl eligibility because the schedule is real tough down the stretch here. They play Penn State. Yep. They play Ohio State as well too. So for Michigan, I think this is a one where they're really, really motivated to play well. And not that I think that necessarily is the overriding factor in this. We've kind of already run through it, and motivation normally isn't, but this is a team that obviously has championship pedigree and still has that component to it, and a very proud program playing at home. So I don't think you expect them to roll over.
100%. All right. We're at the 45-minute mark. Anything else?
No, I hope you have a great time out in Michigan, Jared. And I hope you can find parking. Those are my 2 wishes for you.
Yeah, we won't. We don't need to publicly disclose that stuff. Yeah, that's it for me. I don't have anything else, but yeah, again, Oregon, Michigan, play each other this Saturday, November 2nd at 12:30 p.m. on your local CBS affiliate or Paramount Plus for those of you who subscribe to Duck Territory and have a VIP membership. Paramount Plus for the whole year is on us, not actually us, but
let's
company.
sell a subscription. If you sign up, you get free Paramount Plus, and you can watch this weekend's game. So if you're currently without basic cable and you don't have Paramount Plus, sign up and you get our coverage on our site plus the ability to watch this football game.
Tell them Eric sent you.
Just say Eric's. Yeah, and you get, and I'll get a bonus or something.
Yeah, it'll be great. But yeah, 12:30 p.m. CBS, Oregon, Michigan. That's it for us. Thank you all for listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast. Please leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe, 5-star review, do whatever it is you do with podcasts. If you interact with them, we'll greatly appreciate it. But once again, thank you guys all for listening. I appreciate it.
Talk to you later, folks.